Welcome to Galactic University, where humans are fragile. The admissions packet hadn't mentioned anything about protective bubbles. Yet here I was, staring at what looked like a giant hamster ball designed for human use, while Administrator Clax's tentacles waved in what I assumed was meant to be a reassuring pattern. Standard safety protocol for Class 12 species, they explained, their translator struggling to convey the mix of concern and bureaucratic inflexibility in their tone. All extremely fragile beings must be properly contained for their own protection. I took a deep breath, counting backward from 10 as I'd been doing increasingly often since arriving at Galactic University. Administrator Clax, with all due respect, I'm from Earth. We're not actually Class 12. Ah yes, Earth. Clax's tentacles rippled in what I'd learned was their species equivalent of consulting notes. Gravity, crushing. Atmosphere, caustic. Biosphere, actively hostile. Temperature variations, extreme. Native species, remarkably delicate given environmental conditions. Classification, protected death world. Protected death world. I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. Who exactly are you protecting us from? Why, the universe, of course. Clax's chromatophores flashed in patterns that suggested they thought this was obvious. Your species has done remarkably well, considering your limitations. Making it to space at all with such primitive calcium-based support structures. Truly inspiring. I glanced down at my supposedly primitive skeletal system, then back at the hamster ball of safety. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Humans aren't actually fragile. We're quite resilient. Oh, you poor thing. Clax's tentacles drooped in what appeared to be pity. Your species' psychological defense mechanisms are even more developed than our xenopsychology department theorized. Denying your inherent fragility must be how you cope with existing on such a hostile world. Before I could argue further, a chime sounded through the administrative complex. Clax's chromatophores shifted to what I was starting to recognize as their official business pattern. Your first class begins in 15 minutes. I simply cannot allow you to attend without proper safety measures. They gestured to the hamster ball again. It's for your own protection. I looked at the ball, then at my class schedule projected in softly glowing letters above my university-issued datapad. Xenobiology 401 with Professor Nick Svell. The same Professor Nick Svell who, according to the university's database, had published several papers on the remarkable survival of primitive species in hostile environments. This was going to be interesting. Administrator Clax, I said, drawing myself up to my full height, which, admittedly, wasn't particularly impressive by galactic standards. I appreciate your concern, but I need to make something clear. I will not be using the protective bubble. I will not be requiring gravity adjustment. And I absolutely will not be treated like I'm made of spun sugar. Clax's tentacles twisted in distress. But the regulations clearly state. The regulations, I interrupted, were written by species who think Earth is a death world. Tell me, Administrator, have you ever actually met a human before? Well, no, Clax admitted, their chromatophores shifting to a pattern I hadn't seen before. You're the first one to attend Galactic University in person rather than via holographic presence. Then maybe, I suggested, you should wait to see how I do before deciding I need to be bubble-wrapped. There was a long pause as Clax's tentacles writhed in what I assumed was deep thought. Finally, their chromatophores settled into a more muted pattern. I will need you to sign several liability waivers, they said, still sounding uncertain. And agree to wear an emergency beacon at all times. Deal. I'd take the beacon over the hamster ball any day. As I headed to my first class, datapad in hand and emergency beacon pinned discreetly to my collar, I couldn't help but wonder what other misconceptions I'd be dealing with. The university's database had been fascinating reading, particularly the sections about Earth. According to galactic classification standards, my home planet was a Category 5 death world, a designation usually reserved for actively hostile environments like volcanic moons or acid planets. The fact that we not only survived there but built civilizations, developed technology, and made it to space seemed to have convinced much of the galactic community that humans must possess some sort of mystical resilience that compensated for our primitive biology. The truth, that we were simply well adapted to our environment, seemed to escape them entirely. The xenobiology classroom was exactly what you'd expect from an advanced alien university, assuming you expected something that looked like a cross between a modern art installation and a technology museum. The walls shifted colors based on some pattern I couldn't quite grasp, and instead of desks, there were various learning stations adapted for different species' physiologies. I was directed to what appeared to be a standard chair surrounded by so many safety features it looked more like a space shuttle seat. Next to me, a being that appeared to be made entirely of crystalline structures emitted a high-pitched tone that my translator rendered as a mix between a laugh and a warning. Careful, they chimed, their facets reflecting the room's shifting colors. That seat is rated for fragile species. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something more robust? I was saved from responding by the arrival of Professor Nix Vell, who turned out to be exactly what you'd get if you asked an AI to combine a lava lamp with a doctoral degree. Their gelatinous form flowed into the room, educational credentials somehow visible floating within their transparent body. Ah, our new Earth student. Their voice emerged from somewhere within their mass, managing to sound both professionally interested and personally concerned. I trust Administrator Clax provided you with appropriate safety equipment. I declined the hamster ball, I said, settling into my over-engineered chair. I hope that won't be a problem. A ripple of what might have been surprise, or possibly horror, passed through the professor's form. But surely, given Earth's extreme conditions, you must require some form of protective equipment. I pulled out my data pad, ready to take notes. Professor, I grew up on Earth. Trust me, I'm perfectly adapted to handle a classroom environment. Fascinating, they burbled, their form rippling with what I was beginning to recognize as academic interest overriding safety concerns. And you experience no adverse effects from our standard atmospheric composition? None whatsoever. Remarkable. Their educational credentials swirled faster. Perhaps you would be willing to participate in a research study? The xenobiology department has long wondered how Earth species cope with their planet's hostile environment. I couldn't help but smile. Actually, Professor, I think you might find that humans aren't coping with a hostile environment at all. We're thriving in the environment we evolved to inhabit. The crystalline being next to me made another chiming sound. But Earth has liquid water literally falling from the sky. How is that not hostile? We call that rain, I explained patiently. And it's essential for life on Earth. A ripple of what was definitely horror passed through the classroom. Professor Nix Vell's form actually wavered for a moment. Perhaps, they suggested, their voice wobbling slightly, we should begin today's lesson on environmental adaptation. Student. They consulted their records. Alexandria, would you be comfortable sharing some insights about Earth's unique challenges? I thought about the hamster ball waiting in Administrator Clax's office, and about all the misconceptions these brilliant beings had about my home planet. Then I thought about the presentation I'd prepared for just such an opportunity. Actually, Professor, I said, pulling up my files, I'd love to tell you about some of Earth's native species. Would you like to start with our oceans? They cover most of our planet's surface, and the creatures that live there are particularly interesting. The crystalline being leaned forward, their structure chiming with curiosity. Surely nothing could survive in such conditions. I smiled, queuing up my first image. Let me tell you about something we call a colossal squid. Learning curves, when cultures collide. The thing about being the only human at Galactic University is that every day brings a new lesson in cultural misunderstandings. Sometimes they're amusing, like the time the cafeteria staff tried to sterilize my sandwich because they thought raw vegetables would kill me. Other times, they're more challenging, like today's emergency response to my morning workout routine. But you were deliberately stressing your musculature. The medical officer, a floating cloud of bioluminescent particles named Dr. Lum, pulsed with agitation. The monitoring systems detected elevated heart rate, increased respiratory effort, and microscopic tissue damage. I sat on the edge of the medical bay's examination platform, still in my workout clothes, trying not to laugh at the array of concerned alien medical professionals surrounding me. That's called exercise, Dr. Lum. It's actually necessary for human health. Intentional self-damage for health. A nearby crystalline medical student chimed in frequencies that my translator rendered as deeply skeptical. That seems counterintuitive. Look, I said, pulling up some basic human physiology data on my pad. When humans stress our muscles through exercise, they adapt by becoming stronger. It's not damage, it's improvement. The medical team huddled around my pad, their various forms of expression, rippling, chiming, glowing, and waving, all conveying different shades of fascination and horror. Remarkable, Dr. Lum pulsed thoughtfully. Your species actively seeks out stress to induce biological adaptation. This explains much about your historical records. I was about to ask what exactly they meant by that when my pad chimed with an urgent message from Professor Nick Svell. After my presentation on ocean life last week, which had resulted in 3 crystalline students temporarily destabilizing and 1 energy being going into emergency dormancy, they'd become intensely interested in human adaptability. They want me to give a guest lecture. I read the message twice to be sure. To the entire xenobiology department. Oh my, Dr. Lum's particles swirled in what I'd learned was their equivalent of raised eyebrows. The academic community is taking notice of you, Alexandria. They weren't wrong. Ever since the squid incident, as it was now being called, I'd noticed a shift in how the university's faculty treated me. The protective paranoia was still there, but it was increasingly tempered by scientific curiosity. Just yesterday, I'd caught 2 professors from the evolutionary studies department following me with scanning devices. Perhaps, the crystalline medical student chimed hopefully, you could explain more about human adaptive behaviors? For medical research purposes, of course. I looked around the medical bay, taking in the advanced technology designed to heal dozens of different species, none of which quite knew what to make of humans. An idea began to form. Actually, I said slowly, I think I might have a better idea. How would you all like to help me with a little demonstration? The xenobiology lecture hall was packed. Not just with students, but with faculty from multiple departments. I even spotted Administrator Clax's tentacles waving nervously from the back row. Professor Nick Svell's form rippled with barely contained excitement as they introduced me. Our Earth student has agreed to provide insights into human physiological adaptability, they burbled. Given recent revelations about Earth species, this should prove illuminating. I stepped up to the presentation area, nodding thanks to Dr. Lum and their team who had helped set up the demonstration equipment. Before I begin, I said, looking out at the assembled beings, I'd like to address something that's been bothering me since I arrived here. The room quieted, even the ambient hum of energy beings dropping to a whisper. You all think humans are fragile because we come from what you call a death world. But you're missing something crucial, we don't just survive on Earth. We're built for it. I activated the first display, showing a human skeletal system. You call our calcium-based support structure primitive. But this system has allowed us to run down prey over long distances, survive falls that would shatter crystalline forms, and heal from injuries that would be fatal to many species. A ripple of surprise went through the audience. I continued, warming to my topic. You think our need for sleep makes us vulnerable. But during sleep, our bodies repair themselves, our minds process information, and we become stronger. You see our liquid water requirement as a weakness, but that same water makes up most of our bodies, allowing us to regulate temperature and survive in conditions that would destroy many of your species. I nodded to Dr. Lum, who activated the medical monitors they'd set up. Today, I'm going to demonstrate something that seems to terrify everyone here: human exercise. The next hour was interesting. I took them through a basic workout routine, explaining each movement and its purpose. The medical monitors displayed my vital signs, which caused periodic waves of concern through the audience, especially during the high-intensity intervals. "Notice," I said between sets of push-ups, "how my body adapts to the stress. Heart rate increases to supply oxygen, muscles engage to handle load, sweat helps regulate temperature. But the micro-tears in your muscle fibers," one horrified professor called out. "The strain on your cardiovascular system." "All part of the process," I explained, moving on to squats. "This controlled stress triggers adaptation. Tomorrow, I'll be stronger." The demonstration concluded with a comparison of my baseline readings from arrival at the university to current data, showing improved metrics across the board. The audience was silent, processing. Finally, a small energy being near the front spoke up. "You're saying humans don't just endure stress, you actively seek it out to improve yourselves." "Exactly," I said, wiping my face with a towel. "What you see as vulnerability, we see as opportunity for growth." Professor Nick Svell's form rippled thoughtfully. "This changes many of our assumptions about Earth species. If what you're demonstrating is typical, then perhaps we've misunderstood the entire concept of environmental adaptation." "That's what I've been trying to tell you," I said, pulling up one final display, a timeline of human achievement. "We didn't survive Earth despite its conditions. We became what we are because of them." The implications of this seemed to ripple through the audience like a wave. I could almost see various species' thinking patterns shifting, re-evaluating their understanding of humanity and, perhaps more importantly, their definition of strength. Administrator Clax's tentacles waved for attention. "But surely, given these revelations, we should be even more concerned for your safety. If your species routinely engages in self-stress for improvement." I cut them off gently. "What you should understand is that humans don't need protection from challenge. We need the freedom to face it on our own terms." As the audience began to disperse, still buzzing, in some cases literally, with discussion, Dr. Lum floated over to me. "I believe," they pulsed thoughtfully, "we may need to revise our medical protocols for human students." Finally, I grinned, taking a long drink of water. "Does this mean I can get that protective bubble reassigned as exercise equipment?" The look of horror that passed through their bioluminescent forms suggested that might be pushing things a bit too far. "Baby steps," I reminded myself. "We'd get there eventually." Cultural gravity, when worlds collide. It started with a simple question during my interstellar sociology class. Professor Zinn, a being composed of pure energy contained within an environmental suit, had been lecturing about cultural adaptation mechanisms when they said something that caught my attention. Of course, species from protected worlds often develop complex social structures to compensate for their physical limitations. I couldn't let that one slide. "Professor, could you explain what you mean by compensate?" The professor's energy form flickered in what I'd learned was their equivalent of a scholarly adjustment of glasses. "Ah, yes. Take Earth cultures, for instance. Your species developed elaborate social hierarchies and technological dependencies to survive in an environment that would otherwise be unsurvivable." The crystalline student next to me, Vri, who'd actually started sitting closer after my exercise demonstration last week, chimed in with an amused frequency. "But Alexandria has shown that humans are more resilient than we thought. Perhaps we should re-evaluate our assumptions." I shot Vri a grateful look. After the exercise demonstration, a small but growing number of students had begun questioning the university's standard views on human fragility. But old perceptions die hard. An interesting point, Professor Zinn conceded, their energy form pulsing thoughtfully. "Alexandria, would you care to share your perspective on Earth's social development?" I stood, activating my datapad's projection function. Actually, Professor, I've been working on something that might help explain this better. With your permission. They gestured with a tendril of energy for me to proceed. Everyone here knows Earth is classified as a death world, I began, but what you might not realize is how that classification has led to some fundamental misunderstandings about human culture. I pulled up an image of an ancient cave painting, showing humans hunting together. You see our social structures as compensation for weakness. We see them as multiplication of strength. Humans didn't band together because we were weak, we did it because we discovered that together we could take down prey larger than any individual hunter. The class stirred with interest. Even Professor Zin's energy patterns showed intense focus. But surely, a gaseous student wafted from the back, your technological development was driven by environmental pressures? The need to create artificial environments to survive? I switched to an image of early human tools. We didn't develop technology because we couldn't survive without it. We developed it because we could imagine better ways to thrive. There's a crucial difference. Fascinating, Professor Zin interjected. You're suggesting that human cultural development was driven by ambition rather than necessity? Not exactly, I said, changing the display to show various human achievements throughout history. I'm saying that for humans, necessity and ambition are often the same thing. We don't just adapt to survive, we adapt to excel. The discussion that followed was one of the most engaging I'd experienced at Galactic University. Students from various species offered their perspectives on cultural development, and for the first time, I felt like they were really trying to understand human culture rather than just categorize it. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, I'd been invited to speak to multiple classes about human cultural development. But the real breakthrough came during lunch in the university's central atrium. I was sitting with my growing group of friends, Vri, a plasma-based student named Zor, and surprisingly, Administrator Klax, who had taken to joining us occasionally, for safety monitoring purposes, but seemed genuinely interested in our conversations. I still don't understand, Zor was saying, their plasma swirling with curiosity, if humans are as adaptable as you've shown, why did the initial surveys classify Earth as needing protection? Actually, Klax's tentacles waved thoughtfully, I've been researching this. The classification wasn't based on human capabilities at all, it was based on initial sensor readings of Earth's environment. Exactly, I said, taking a bite of my sandwich, which the cafeteria had finally stopped trying to sterilize. The first survey ships detected our atmospheric composition, gravity, and biodiversity, and essentially said nothing could possibly live there naturally. But clearly things do live there, Vri chimed. Quite successfully, in fact. Which raises an interesting question, a new voice joined in. We looked up to see Professor Nix Bell's gelatinous form approaching our table. If we were wrong about Earth's habitability, what else might we be wrong about? The professor's question sparked something of a revolution in the university's academic community. Over the next few weeks, I found myself at the center of a growing movement to reevaluate not just Earth's classification, but the entire system of categorical assumptions about species development. It wasn't always smooth sailing. Some faculty members strongly resisted any suggestion that their long-held theories might need revision. But the evidence was becoming harder to ignore, especially after I organized what I called a cultural exchange fair. The fair was meant to be a small event, just a few demonstrations of Earth customs and achievements alongside similar showcases from other worlds. But it quickly grew into something much bigger. Students from dozens of species set up displays about their homeworld's cultural developments. I contributed sections on Earth art, music, literature, and scientific achievements. The highlight was a real-time video link with Earth, showing everyday life in various cities around the world. Your species builds dwellings that tall without anti-gravity support, a group of floating gas-based beings asked, watching footage of New York's skyline. And you actually enjoy consuming chemical-based nutrition, a crystalline professor chimed, fascinated by the cooking demonstrations. But the most profound moment came when I showed them something they'd never expected, Earth's space program. Wait, Administrator Clax's tentacles twisted in confusion. You're saying humans achieved spaceflight using chemical propulsion? Without gravitational manipulation or quantum tunneling? Sometimes, I explained, showing footage of early rocket launches, the most impressive adaptations aren't about having the most advanced solution. They're about finding creative ways to work with what you have. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Within days, the university's curriculum committee announced a comprehensive review of their teaching materials regarding protected worlds. Professor Zin's department began a new research initiative into comparative cultural development patterns. Even the cafeteria started offering Earth-inspired meals, though their interpretation of pizza was interesting. But the real change was in how people treated me, and by extension, how they thought about humans. The protective bubbles disappeared from storage. The constant safety warnings decreased. Instead, there was genuine curiosity about human capabilities and culture. One evening, as I was helping Vri understand the concept of human music, they found the idea of deliberate sound wave manipulation fascinating. They made an observation that stuck with me. You know, they chimed softly. When you first arrived, everyone thought we needed to protect you from the universe. Now we're starting to wonder if maybe we were the ones who needed our perspectives protected from the reality of what beings like you can achieve. I thought about that as I looked out at the alien sunset, its triple stars painting the sky in colors that would have seemed impossible on Earth. Maybe that was the most human adaptation of all, the ability to not just survive in new environments, but to change how those environments viewed us in return. Questions of classification, challenging the status quo. The message that changed everything arrived during my xenopolitics seminar. Professor Nix Vell's gelatinous form burst into the classroom, their educational credentials swirling in what I'd learned to recognize as academic excitement mixed with concern. Alexandria, they burbled urgently, the Galactic Council's Education Committee has requested your presence at their next session. The classroom erupted in a cacophony of chimes, buzzes, and various other species-specific expressions of surprise. Even Professor Tlan, our normally unflappable political science instructor, rippled their quantum probability field in shock. The Education Committee? Vri chimed from beside me, their crystalline structure vibrating with concern. But they oversee all academic classifications in known space. I'd learned enough about galactic politics to understand why this was a big deal. The Education Committee didn't just set curriculum standards, they determined how different species and their homeworlds were classified, which in turn affected everything from research funding to travel restrictions. When? I asked, already pulling up my schedule on my datapad. Next week, Nix Vell replied, their form rippling. They're particularly interested in your perspectives on current classification methodologies. The way they said it made me suspect this wasn't just about academic interest. I was right. The Galactic Council's chambers were exactly what you'd expect from an organization that governed thousands of species across multiple spiral arms, impossibly vast, dizzyingly diverse, and thoroughly intimidating. The Education Committee met in a subsection that looked like a cross between a university lecture hall and a planetary senate. Administrator Clax had insisted on accompanying me for procedural support, though I suspected they were just curious. Their tentacles hadn't stopped moving since we arrived. The committee recognizes Alexandria of Earth, announced the chair being, a massive entity composed of interlinked energy fields. You may approach the central platform. As I stepped forward, I noticed the chamber was packed with representatives from various academic institutions across the galaxy. Many were species I'd never seen before, but they all shared one thing: intense interest in the human standing before them. We have reviewed your activities at Galactic University, the chair being continued, their energy fields pulsing in formal patterns. Your demonstrations and teachings about human adaptability have raised questions. Questions about what, specifically? I asked, keeping my voice steady. About everything. A crystalline committee member chimed in. Your presence at the university has challenged fundamental assumptions about species development, environmental adaptation, and our entire classification system. The protection protocols for Earth were established with the best intentions, added another member, this one a swirling cloud of conscious gas. We believed we were preserving a remarkable but fragile species. I couldn't help but smile. And now? Now we are faced with evidence that our entire understanding of fragile versus resilient species may be fundamentally flawed. The chair being's energy fields flickered thoughtfully. Your demonstrations of human adaptability, both physical and cultural, suggest that our classification systems may be based on incomplete criteria. Incomplete is one way to put it, I said, pulling out my datapad. Would you like to see something interesting? I projected a series of images, human achievements throughout history, but presented alongside environmental conditions that would be considered extreme by galactic standards. Each image was accompanied by data showing how humans had not just survived but thrived in these conditions. These aren't examples of a fragile species needing protection, I explained. They're evidence of a species that views challenges as opportunities for growth. The committee members communicated among themselves in a variety of ways: energy pulses, crystalline resonances, chemical signals. Finally, the chair being spoke again. What would you suggest? How should we revise our understanding? Start by questioning your assumptions, I said. You classified Earth as a death world because it didn't match your criteria for what makes a planet safe. But safe for whom? Every species evolves to thrive in their own environment. But surely some environments are objectively more hostile than others, the gaseous member wafted. Hostile to whom? I countered. A human would find your homeworld's atmosphere instantly fatal. Does that make it a death world? Or does it simply mean that different species have different definitions of hostile? This sparked another round of intense discussion among the committee members. I noticed Administrator Clax's tentacles waving in what I'd learned was their equivalent of proud approval. There's something else you should consider, I continued. By classifying Earth as a protected world, you've been inadvertently limiting humanity's potential for cultural and scientific exchange with other species. This caught their attention. The chair being's energy fields stabilized in a pattern indicating focused interest. Elaborate, they requested. Think about it. How many potential students from Earth have been discouraged from attending galactic institutions because of safety concerns? How many collaborative research projects haven't happened because other species assumed humans were too fragile to participate? We're not asking for protection, we're asking for opportunity. The chamber fell silent, or as silent as it could be with thousands of diverse beings present. Finally, the chair being spoke again. You have given us much to consider. The committee will need time to review our classification protocols and their implications. I nodded, but decided to push a little further. While you're reviewing things, you might want to look at how you classify other species too. I doubt humans are the only ones whose capabilities you've misunderstood. This caused another stir in the chamber. Several representatives from other protected worlds moved forward, their various forms of expression indicating strong agreement. As the session concluded, Administrator Clax approached me, their tentacles moving in complex patterns. You realize, they said, that you may have just initiated the largest revision of galactic classification systems in recent history? I looked around the chamber, where representatives from dozens of worlds were already forming discussion groups, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of intellectual excitement. Good, I replied. Maybe now we can start focusing less on protecting species from the universe and more on helping them explore their own potential. Clax's chromatophores shifted to a pattern I'd never seen before. You know, when you first arrived at the university, I thought my primary duty was to protect you from harm. Now I'm starting to think perhaps I should have been protecting others from their own preconceptions. As we left the chamber, I couldn't help but notice how different things felt from my first day at Galactic University. The protective bubbles and safety warnings seemed like artifacts from another era, one where fear of the unknown had masqueraded as concern for the vulnerable. But the real work was just beginning. Changing official classifications was one thing, changing deeply ingrained perceptions would be quite another. Still, looking at the diverse group of beings now engaged in passionate discussion about species' capability in adaptation, I felt optimistic. After all, adapting to new challenges was what humans did best. Breaking barriers, the future of galactic relations. Looking back on my first year at Galactic University from the podium of the graduation ceremony, it was hard to believe how much had changed. The protective bubbles that once lined the halls had been repurposed into research equipment. The warning signs about fragile species had been replaced with informational displays about diverse biological adaptations. And most importantly, I wasn't the only human on campus anymore. As we conclude this academic year, President ZYX announced, their quantum form shimmering with formal dignity, we celebrate not just individual achievements, but a fundamental shift in our understanding of interspecies capabilities. The assembled crowd, a stunning array of beings from across the galaxy, pulsed, glowed, and resonated with approval. In the front row, I spotted the faces, or equivalent sensory organs, that had become so familiar over the past year, Vria's crystalline form catching the light, Zor's plasma swirling excitedly, and Administrator Klax's tentacles moving in what I now recognized as proud patterns. Following the Galactic Council's revision of species classification protocols, President ZYX continued, Galactic University has welcomed 37 new students from previously restricted worlds, including 15 humans. I couldn't help but smile at the small group of human students sitting together, looking simultaneously awed and determined. They'd arrived just months after my appearance before the Education Committee, part of the first wave of what the university was calling its Adaptive Excellence Initiative. But perhaps more significant than these numbers, the President's quantum field pulsed thoughtfully, is the change in how we approach the very concept of adaptation and capability. That was an understatement. The past year had seen a complete overhaul of the university's curriculum, with new courses focusing on comparative evolutionary advantages and cultural development patterns. My little exercise demonstration had evolved into a full-fledged research program on species-specific physical optimization. After the ceremony, I found myself surrounded by a mix of old friends and new students, all eager to discuss the future. Is it true you're staying on as a teaching assistant? Vri chimed excitedly. Their crystalline structure had developed new facets over the year, which they'd explained was their species' equivalent of personal growth. Actually, I said, I've been offered something more interesting. I pulled up my datapad, showing them the official appointment. The university is creating a new department, Adaptive Cultural Studies. They want me to help develop the curriculum. Most appropriate, Professor Nix Vel burbled, flowing into our group. Their gelatinous form now contained not just their original educational credentials but several new ones earned through their research into human capabilities. Your influence has extended far beyond mere academic reform. They weren't wrong. The changes at Galactic University had sparked a broader movement across the galactic academic community. Other institutions were revising their own classification systems, and research partnerships between previously protected and advanced species were flourishing. Alexandria. A voice called out. I turned to see one of the new human students, Marco, hurrying over. You've got to see this. We just got approval for the cross-species athletics program. This had been one of our more controversial proposals, a physical education program that celebrated different species' natural abilities rather than trying to protect everyone from everything. The approval represented a major shift in the university's approach to safety and capability. Well done, Administrator Klax said, their tentacles moving in complex patterns of approval. Though I must insist on certain basic safety protocols. Of course, I laughed. No one's suggesting we abandon all precautions. We're just saying that growth requires some reasonable risks. As if to emphasize the point, a group of students from various species walked past, engaged in what appeared to be a competitive game they'd invented that took advantage of their different physical capabilities. A crystalline being was using their refractive properties to redirect light for a plasma-based student, who was using it to create intricate patterns that a gaseous being had to navigate through. You see? I gestured to them. That's what happens when you stop focusing on what different species can't do and start exploring what they can do together. Professor Nick's Vell's form rippled with academic satisfaction. Indeed. Our research shows that mixed-species collaborative activities have increased by 300% since the removal of excessive safety restrictions. And accident rates? Administrator Clax asked, their tentacles twitching slightly. Actually decreased, I said, pulling up the statistics. Turns out when you treat people like they're capable, they become more responsible for their own safety. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself in the university's central garden, the same place where I'd once had to argue against wearing a protective bubble. A group of new students from various, previously restricted, worlds were gathered there, sharing stories about their homeworlds. It's not just about humans anymore, Marco commented, joining me in watching them. You started something bigger than that. He was right. What had begun as a challenge to perceptions about human fragility had evolved into a broader conversation about capability, adaptation, and the nature of strength itself. Species that had been classified as vulnerable were demonstrating remarkable abilities when given the chance. Worlds that had been protected were now sharing technological and cultural innovations that had developed in their unique environments. You know what the best part is? I said, watching a crystalline student carefully showing a human how to analyze light patterns through their facets. We're all learning from each other now. Real exchange, not just protection. A chime from my datapad interrupted us, a message from the Galactic Council. They were establishing a new advisory board on interspecies capabilities and wanted representatives from Earth to participate. Not as protected species, but as equals. So, Marco grinned, reading over my shoulder, what's next? I looked out at the garden, where beings from across the galaxy were engaging in exactly the kind of exchange and collaboration we'd hoped for. The protective bubbles were gone, replaced by genuine understanding and respect for different forms of capability. Next. I smiled. We keep adapting. It's what humans do best, and as it turns out, we're not the only ones. Above us, the alien sun set in a riot of colors that would have seemed impossible on Earth, while around us, the future of galactic cooperation was taking shape. Not through protection or restriction, but through understanding, adaptation, and a simple recognition that strength comes in many forms. And somewhere, in a repurposed storage room, a lonely protective bubble gathered dust, a relic of an outdated understanding, replaced by something far more valuable, respect for the incredible diversity of life and its endless capacity to adapt and thrive. The end.